Good morning, everyone. My name is Bernie Becker, and I write the morning tax column for Politico, and I'm your moderator for this morning's event. I'd like to thank the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation for hosting and inviting me to take part. Hope everyone is staying safe and sane as they can these days. In the meantime, we have a very timely debate for you this morning that will tackle the very narrow topic of the future of work and the role tax policy will play in that. On one side, we have Duron of MIT, who will argue that lower taxes on capital have given companies incentives to increase automation for tax purposes and not necessarily to increase productivity, to the detriment of workers. And on the other side, we have Rob Atkinson from our host at ITIF, who will argue that improving technologies has and will spark a growth in productivity that will help workers in a number of fields. And without any further ado, I'd like to turn it over to them to flesh those arguments out even further.
Thank you very much, Bernie. Should I get started? Okay. It's my pleasure to be here with all of you, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about these topics, and I will briefly present the results of some of my recent research, as well as research by others, on taxes and automation. And I want to make a few points in this 7-minute presentation. First, that there have been major problems in the US labor market. I think Exhibit 1 here that I would like to show is how US labor demand has evolved, focusing here on private sector. So I'm showing on the left the evolution of private sector wage bill relative to population in the 4 decades after World War II. This is a remarkable picture because it shows a very, very rapid growth of US businesses' willingness to pay for workers, about 2.5% more in real terms than population growth, pretty much every year for about 40 years. But on the right, you see the picture changes dramatically over the last 3 decades. First, the US businesses' willingness to pay for workers slows down, and then it flattens out that wage bill is actually not growing all that much at all since the late 1990s. This has had many consequences, not least the decline in the share of labor in US GDP and national income, but even more consequentially for many of the social ills affecting the United States, wage inequality and income inequality are intimately related to the slowdown of labor demand. So here I'm showing a well-known picture that indicates how the real wages of different demographic groups have evolved. If you look at the period from the 1940s to the mid-1970s, and here I'm showing it from the 1960s onwards with the higher quality data, this is a typical period of shared prosperity, a rising tide lifting all boats. The real wages of all education groups, from the lowest high school dropouts to the highest with the college graduates, both for men and women, are growing in tandem. But from the 1980s onwards, you see a remarkable fanning out, greater inequality. But even more consequentially, you see huge drops in the real wages of low education men. For example, the red and the orange lines on the left for high school dropouts and high school graduates, but even for those with community college degrees or 2-year degrees with the gray line. This complex phenomenon has many causes, but my research, especially with Pasquale Restrepo and David Outer, has documented that it is intimately linked to the changing direction of technological change. In particular, there's a lot of automation going on over the last 3-4 decades that has led to the disappearance of jobs in production occupations, in clerical occupations, in administrative tasks. And this is closely linked to these inequality patterns and the slowdown of labor demand that I have shown. Just focusing on one archetypal example of automation technology, robots. This is drawing from my recent Journal of Political Economy paper with Pasquale Restrepo. What this shows is that in local labor markets, where you have greater exposure to robots and greater penetration of robots, you have huge declines in private employment, especially when you focus on the few places that I have highlighted on the right, which are the industrial heartland of the United States: Detroit, Lansing, Cleveland, Toledo. These are the places where automation of production jobs, so this is now focusing on industrial automation, has gone fastest, and you see quite significant declines in these places in employment and also wages, which I'm not showing. This relationship is not driven by the few places I have indicated on the right. If you look at the cloud of points, the implied relationship is very similar, but those industrial cities and commuting zones are emblematic of this broad change. Now, I want to highlight or emphasize again that automation is not TFP. TFP, total factor productivity, the measure that economists use for looking at the overall productivity of the private sector or of the economy, is an inclusive measure that includes not just the effects of automation, but a lot of other technologies: labor augmenting, capital augmenting, and also what Pasquale and I call new tasks and reinstating technologies that advance the possibilities for labor in the production process. And the reason why automation is not equal to TFP is twofold, really. First, because TFP is in general driven by a lot of different technologies, not just by automation. If automation goes very fast, but other technologies don't advance, which is the situation that we've had over the last 30 years, this is not going to bring very fast TFP. And also because we may be over-automating. If we automate but introduce things like checkout kiosks that are not really making the production process that much more productive, we are eliminating workers, and we are substituting capital for them. Labor productivity would increase, but total factor productivity, which is the heart of the efficiency of the economy, which corrects for the usage of capital, does not increase. And if you look at the data here across sectors, the relationship between task displacement due to automation, which Pasquale Restrepo and I computed in a different paper, and total factor productivity is very weak. The correlation is about 0.12, as you can see from this picture. But the question then remains, what about taxes? Are we adopting the right tax policy, and are we actually encouraging automation, or even excessive automation, through taxes? Well, the first step in that is to actually look at what we do with our taxes. That's no simple matter because the tax code in the US is very complex. But if you do that computation, which Pasquale Restrepo, Andrea Manera, and I have done in another recent paper, you see that the US has always taxed labor more heavily than capital. So going back to the 1980s and the 1990s, labor is taxed about 25%, payroll plus income taxes for ordinary workers, whereas capital was taxed around 15%, especially software and equipment capital. In fact, software as high as 20% for much of the 1990s. But since the late 1990s, especially 2000, the tax rates on capital have come down, so much so that some corporations actually get subsidies when they buy machines. And that is especially true for software and equipment that are used not just for automation, but heavily in automation. There are many reasons for these changes, but depreciation allowances that have become extremely generous is one of them. And many companies changing their tax status to S corporations so that they avoid corporate taxes is another important element. This tax inequity between labor and capital is one of the contributors to excessive automation. And it is excessive, it is driven by this tax system, because what it implies is that companies can actually reduce their costs if they replace labor by capital, even if their productive efficiency, as measured by the TFP, as in the previous figure, is not changing. Why? Because when they are employing labor, they're going to pay 25% taxes. When they instead automate, they're not going to pay that tax. So the tax wedge is going to create an incentive for automation, and that's generally going to be in the excessive direction, because it's going to encourage you to automate the tasks that you would not have done otherwise, you would not have done without the tax inducement. So what is the bottom line? Is this an argument against automation and robots? Hell no. I'm not saying that automation and robots are bad. Not at all. But we need a more balanced technological approach, just like after World War II. when automation went hand in hand and was counterbalanced by human-friendly technologies. If you look at the earlier period, mechanization of agriculture, if you look at introduction of telephone switches, if you look at other technologies on the factory floor, they had the same effect, that when they were introduced as an automation technology, they pushed labor out. But we found jobs for that labor in the same firms, in the same industry or some other industries, because there was a lot of other types of technological change. And again, that's shown in this figure, drawing from another work that I have done with Pascual Restrepo. In that 4 decades that I showed, things were growing relatively fast for labor. Labor demand was growing relatively fast. Displacement due to automation was broadly counterbalanced by reinstatement. The sum of the two is this is line around 0. But look at the last 3 decades. The reinstatement has gone very slow, very little technological change other than automation. Automation is going much faster, and this is heading south, explaining what I showed in the first slide. So the bottom line is that we need a broad agenda for encouraging other types of technologies in addition to automation, not instead of automation. And in that endeavor, removing the asymmetric treatment of capital and labor would be an important tool for us, because that wedge between capital and labor is encouraging precisely the type of excessive automation that is not bringing that much productivity gain, but it is causing displacement. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Duron, for those comments, and I appreciate you joining us to have this discussion. So let me just jump right in. Duron is making really 5 main points to support his argument that there's too much automation today. One is he's saying that there are negative labor market outcomes from too much automation, including, second, that automation leads to increased unemployment. Third, he's saying that automation eliminates work automation that eliminates work rather than complements work doesn't really boost productivity that much. That was his point about TFP. The fourth is that the tax code favors automation or equipment over labor. And 5, that there are negative externalities from investment in automation technology. And therefore, if you believe this, then the only logical thing for policymakers to do is to try to slow down automation, particularly labor replacing automation. But I will argue that all 5 of those points are not really borne out by scholarly work or evidence. So, for example, he talks about negative labor market outcomes such as a declining labor share of income. That's been very clearly proven, as we've done and other work, including former Obama White House economist Jason Furman, that this is all due to increase in rental income. It's not due to really an increase in capital income. Labor income's gone down, rental income's gone up. That's because our house values are worth more, and the way that the way BEA counts that is they count it as we're paying ourselves for rent. So there's nothing really to do with automation that the labor share of income is down. Second, he makes a point in his paper that there's more rapid displacement of workers due to automation. And yet, when you look at the BLS numbers, the risk of losing your job from downsizing or closure in 2015 was the lowest since 1995. Every year since 1995, the risk of layoffs has gone down. He talks about a slowdown in labor demand. There's been no slowdown in labor demand when we had the lowest rate of unemployment in decades in 2018 and 2019. That's not a slowdown. That's a speed up of labor demand. He talks about slow wage growth. And absolutely, there's been slow wage growth, but it's not because of too much automation. It's too little automation. The reason late wage growth has slowed, or a big factor of it, is that productivity growth has slowed. It went from 2.6% in the post-war period to 89 to less than 2%, around 2% since then. He talks about the fact that we have all this speed up in automation, and yet according to an ITIF study, we're 16th among nations in robot adoption when you control for wages. Again, the sort of notion that we've been investing too much and it's why TFP has gone down. In fact, according to the BEA, investment in machinery has gone down 21% as a share of GDP over the last 20 years. He also assumes that robots lead to job loss, and he looks at local labor market impact. But you can't really look at local labor market impacts. You have to look at national labor market impacts. They might lead to job loss in a local area, but reduce prices around the country, which leads to more jobs. In fact, a number of studies have found that robots actually increase unemployment. Jun Mittag and Pasal looked at 41 countries between 2000 and 2014, and they found that robot adoption actually increased employment 0.32% annually. And this is really, I think, in part, Duron is succumbing to what economists call the lump of labor fallacy, that once a job is eliminated, it's gone. And so we've lost that output. And that's simply not the case. Labor always gets reabsorbed, and you create new jobs. He talks about this sort of in the paper. He talks about this notion of what he calls so-so automation. In other words, that some automation is good and some is bad. And he talks about, for example, when you go to the airport and you use a self-check-in kiosk. Look, all automation is good. All automation boosts productivity. There's no company that installs automation equipment unless they think it's going to save them money. And so think about elevator operators. We don't have elevator operators because that's automation. We don't have to deal with millions of having telephone operators because we used automated switches. Those are all automation technologies. They lead to lower prices. They lead to higher productivity. And I want to lastly talk about the notion that the tax code is somehow distorted and leading to bad decisions. Duron makes 2 points. He talks about that labor taxes are essentially too high and capital taxes are too low. The first point is just simply not really accurate. He talks about labor taxes that's essentially employers pay, and he's saying that employer-paid payroll taxes don't come at the expense of wages. So in other words, if we have employer-paid payroll, if we have payroll taxes that employers pay, it raises the price of labor, and therefore leads to less of it. In fact, as Milton Friedman has argued, he talked about payroll taxes as, quote, a compulsory tax that isn't paid by the employer. It is, in effect, paid by the wage earner in terms of lower wages. And Emmanuel Saz, a very well-known and quite liberal economist, recently did a study, and he showed that the economic incidence of employer-paid payroll taxes fully resides with the employer. So absent payroll taxes, wages would be higher, and there'd be the same sort of, if you will, disincentive to hire labor. The same thing is true, and even more so, with income taxes. Employers don't pay the cost of my income tax. ITIF doesn't pay me more because I have to pay federal income tax. So Duron counts that in that graph you saw, where employment taxes were high, labor taxes were high, capital taxes were low. But employers don't pay that tax. If we raise the same amount of money, we abolish the income tax and had more money in property and sales taxes, workers would still get paid the exact same amount. Lastly, companies can write off all their expenditures in the first year on worker training. Duron sort of talks about accelerated depreciation on equipment distorts the tax code. Well, companies can write off expenditures on worker training, even though those expenditures don't accrue benefits in the first year. They're capitalized expenditures that, in theory, should be expensed. Should be used in terms of deducting every year. And secondly, he significantly understates the taxes on machinery. He writes in his paper, for example, in 2014, that the estimated tax rate on software for companies was 11%, and on structures was 8%. And yet, when you look at the CBO study, the definitive CBO study that looked at the tax rate on all sorts of various things that companies paid, CBO identified the tax rate on software not at 11%, but at 38%, and structures not at 8%, but at 24%. There was another very good study by the Tax Foundation that found that the marginal effective tax rate on corporate investment in machinery, even with full expensing that came about in the last tax bill fall, is 43%. So it's not 8%, it's not 11%, it's significantly higher. So if anything, we're taxing capital much more than we're taxing labor. The other component he makes is, another argument he makes is that capital tax is essentially equal to the tax on equipment, but it's not. A capital tax is a tax on profits. You could make those profits by hiring a worker. You could make the profits by buying a machine. They're both generating capital. So how much we tax corporations in terms of their tax rate or on dividends or capital gains, it has nothing to do with the marginal tax rate on equipment. In fact, CBO defines capital income as receipts minus the cost of goods and operating expenses, and it includes in operating expenses the cost of labor. So whatever the overall capital tax is, it has really nothing to do with the marginal tax on equipment. And the last point I'll just make, even if we were taxing capital machinery at the same rate as labor, which we probably are, if not, frankly, taxing it higher, there's a really strong argument to tax it at significantly less. And that's because there's a lot of good studies. In fact, a recent one from Larry Summers and economist Ben Jones that found that the social rate of return from capital investment is 27%. In other words, companies don't get all the benefits from putting in automation equipment. Society gets a lot of benefits from higher innovation and spillovers. And it's actually exactly like R&D. And we have an R&D tax credit, as economists support, to sort of balance out private rates of return and social rates of return. And we should do the same thing with capital, in my opinion. So we're taxing it not too much, not too little, but actually too much. So with that, I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob, for those comments. And some of them go into details, so I'll have to respond to a few of those details, and I apologize in advance if it gets into the weeds a little bit, but I think it's important to clarify a few points and remove some confusion. So first of all, on the labor share, I think there is broadly agreement in the economics literature that the labor share has fallen. My own work with Pascual Restrepo has documented that focuses on that concentrates in the production sector. It's been much more systematically documented by work by David Otter, Christina Patterson, Larry Katz, and co-authors. And it's true in a number of other advanced economies as well. I think the little confusion here is that the capital income on the household side is different than capital income on the production side. You need to compute them differently. And the residential housing is not on the production side. So whatever happens to the residential housing, which Rob mentioned, and that's actually a point that was originally made by my former student, Matt Ronley, but that's for the household side. It has no relevance for the argument that I'm making and has no relevance for automation. On the production side, the capital share has increased quite significantly, and it's been extremely well documented. Rob mentioned that robots or automation is not reducing employment or causing displacement. Well, again, here we have to go into the details of the studies. And I showed you a picture from my own work, which was published in recently. And obviously, I didn't go into the details, but I can assure you the approach we adopt is not one that is subject to the lump of labor fallacy, nor does it ignore the fact that adoption of robots and cost reductions change prices and affects the rest of the country. Those are all accounted for. But we are not alone. If you don't want to believe our results, there are now studies that are carefully done for the Netherlands, China, France, Spain, and Germany. And in all of these cases, as well as the US one that we have, the evidence is very clear that adoption of robots or other automation technologies is causing displacement, is leading to the job loss by production workers or affected workers, and is creating downward pressure on wages. And of course, if it weren't like that, you should be really surprised, and you should really question what the economists are up to, really, because what are automation technologies doing? They're taking tasks that were previously performed by labor and having capital produce it. Of course, there's a productivity effect, which means that because this reduces costs, firms themselves can expand and other firms can expand, but that productivity effect needs to be very large to undo the displacement effect. And what we have seen in the data, I showed you that precisely, the labor demand trends, is that there has not been that productivity effect. Automation technologies, even the best one of them, which is robots, have not been sufficiently productive to undo the displacement effect through these changes in the willingness of other firms or other tasks to hire. Since time is short, let me not talk about some of the other claims that Rob made on layoffs and linking that to automation. That is completely different, because layoffs are caused by a whole lot of other factors, and you cannot just say layoffs and automation are the same. And that's why we use microdata to build up measures of displacement from automation. But let me come back to taxes at the end. So there are two claims that Rob made, which I'll take issue with both of them. The first one, he stated categorically that somehow payroll taxes and labor income taxes from the federal income tax are borne by workers. Well, that's the area of public finance. This is what you learn in your first microeconomics course, including in my own book on Principles of Economics with David Leibson and John List. We go through this in great detail. Any tax can be borne by either the firm or the worker, depending on the elasticity of the factor in question. So if labor is supplied completely inelastically, which means that workers will work whatever the wage is, then all taxes are borne by labor. But if labor is supplied elastically, then both income taxes that workers pay and payroll taxes that firms pay will have an incidence on workers. This is, basic economics that you learn as a 19-year-old in your first course in economics. So the question turns down, is labor supplied fully inelastically? Well, there is no evidence whatsoever that labor is supplied fully inelastically. All the evidence we know is that for a variety of reasons, both preferences, household behavior, imperfections, labor supply is fairly elastic, actually is as elastic as capital. And in fact, one great study that looks at that is, perhaps that's the one that Rob was referring to, is by Emmanuel Saez and co-authors that came out in the American Economic Review last year, looking at a payroll tax reform in Sweden. But unfortunately, I think it's exactly the opposite of what Rob said. Their study, which is a very careful one, finds that almost all of the incidence is on firms. So actually, labor looks very elastic, at least in the Swedish context. And there are other studies in the US that point out in the same direction, though perhaps not as clear and clean as that. Now, is the tax rate on capital really as low as Rob says? Well, we have to go into the details, and that's why we wrote a very, very detailed paper with Andrea Manera and Pascual Restrepo that was published in the Brookings Papers on Economic Activity. Our numbers are actually very consistent with both the CBO numbers and other recent work by Zidar, but we do certain things differently, and we are more detailed in especially how different types of financing of capital equipment investments and different types of corporations do it. The CBO number is actually a little bit different when you look at it exactly in the most recent period, but that's for a very, very simple reason, that CBO says, well, depreciation allowances are temporary, so we're not actually going to include them in our tax estimate. So if you include the depreciation allowances, which the CBO doesn't, so you could misread their study, you would think that capital taxes are actually higher than they are. But if you put the depreciation allowances, which is the main driver of that decline, you get very similar numbers to the ones that we have. So the bottom line is, in fact, capital is taxed very, very, very lightly in the United States. We really are subsidizing firms to use machinery instead of labor. Thank you.
Thank you. So let me just quickly respond to those, some of the responses from Duron. First of all, labor share has fallen, but it's the same as it was essentially in the 1930s and 40s, where in theory you had the right kind of automation and productivity. we've made that point in a recent study. And again, I go back to this. The way one has to look at labor share of income is by looking at the BEA national income accounts, and that's the official source of this. And if you look at a recent study by Jason Furman and Peter Orszag, they're both leading Obama economic officials. They said, quote, "The decline of labor share of income is not due to an increase in the share of income going to productive capital, which has largely been stable, but instead due to an increased share of income going to housing capital." What else can I say? That's not the reason there's a declining labor share of income. It's not because we're automating too much. And the second point is Duron is using a lot of these micro studies to show that there's automation that reduces jobs. There are many, many studies. There are some studies that show that it does, and there are many, many studies that show that it doesn't. And I reviewed some of those. There's another study in the EU by an economist, Godsey, who found in a study that robots increase employment on an average of 5 workers per robot between 1995 and 2015. But even if you're willing to agree with Duron that somehow companies that install robots have fewer workers, sometimes they do and sometimes they don't, and it's largely because of the elasticity of demand of their product. Even if you believe they don't, to somehow argue that that would change employment in the overall economy, at least in the moderate term, is just simply, it's not logical. And it's certainly not borne out by fact and evidence. McKinsey Global Institute showed that there's no relationship between productivity growth and employment or unemployment. We see that, in fact, it's the opposite. And in decades where the U.S. has high unemployment, in general, it's associated with low productivity growth. And the reason that's the case is when companies increase productivity, what do they do with it? They don't keep the money. Largely, that gets all either put principally in prices, so lower prices, so consumers have more money. They go spend more money on restaurants or whatever they spend it on, and that creates more jobs. So again, this notion somehow that we need to be concerned with the rate of automation and overall employment is just simply not borne out by the evidence. Again, I don't agree with Duron on the CBO numbers. That's not, in my view, not what the CBO has said. And again, I go back to the Tax Foundation, which did their own independent study and found, with depreciation included, much, much higher rates upon capital. And again, the other point here is if we're treating capital or machinery so generously, why has it gone down by 21%? Why are companies investing very little in capital equipment now compared to what they used to spend? I want to talk about the wage issue. There's this notion, I think it boils down to sort of mistaking microeconomics with macroeconomics, which is what a lot of economists do. They say, okay, well, robots increase unemployment, so therefore late workers have less demand, and therefore they have less bargaining power, and therefore wages don't go up or even go down. And the only problem with that theory is it's premised on the notion that it leads to higher structural unemployment, and so you have this lumpen proletariat that can't sort of bid for higher wages. Again, the evidence shows that's actually the opposite. Higher productivity means lower unemployment. So in that sense, it can't reduce wages. Secondly, the idea that it would reduce wages suggests, by definition, where does that output go? And by definition, it has to go to capital. In other words, it has to go to higher profits. And yet, again, a study that my colleague Joe Kennedy did for us, when you go back and you look at the BEA numbers on profits for the non-financial domestic industries, so in other words, industries in the U.S. that are not banks, what you find is that profits were higher back in the 50s and 60s, almost significantly higher. The profits in the last 15 years have not been higher than they were historically. So there's just no evidence that somehow labor share of labor market ability to negotiate for wages is meaning that because of automation is meaning that all the money is going to capital. It's simply not. And then lastly, Duron's point about workers bearing the burden. Again, virtually every study shows that workers bear most of the burden. So, for example, there's a study by Melguzzi and Gonzalez-Paramo, and they looked at 52 studies over the last 15 years, 52 peer-reviewed academic studies, kind of as a meta-analysis, and they found that workers bear 70% of the burden, not 0% of the burden. So again, this notion somehow that we're undertaxing labor the price of labor is too high because of taxes is just simply wrong, or at least not borne out.
All right, well, that was very interesting, guys. I can tell you that it has sparked lots of questions from the audience. So I'm going to intersperse those with my own questions. And I'll start out, and it may be too soon to have a good answer to this, but the elephant in the room for anything these days is the coronavirus. And I'm wondering if, that's, automation and tech has sort of allowed a lot of us to work from home that we, to survive in ways we might not have before, but it's also sort of shown divisions in society about how people work. And I wonder if is it too soon, or has the way this year has gone changed your thinking on any of the stuff that you've been that's been part of today's debate?
Well, let me jump on that. I think that's actually a great question, and it also enables me to clarify one thing, that when we are talking of automation, it's not just robots. Robots is just one example. A lot of what the future holds is algorithmic automation. And I think all the evidence is that we are at a cusp. The coronavirus has highlighted how much we depend on digital technologies. I mean, we wouldn't be able to have this conversation if the digital technologies weren't where they are. And their role is going to grow. But the question is, where will these digital technologies go? So according to recent surveys, over 75% of US companies say that they are taking steps or have already done so for more automation because of the COVID-19 situation, social distancing, work on absences, and all of these other problems. So that suggests that, again, consistent with work that Pasquale and I have done, as well as work that I have with David Otter on AI, that algorithmic technologies are also going in the direction of automation, and we may actually be doing more so because of the coronavirus. But in fact, the value of the digital technologies also highlights we could do so many different things. So Zoom is not an automation technology. We are actually augmenting ourselves. We are enabling people like me and Rob to talk to each other, and Bernie to mediate this discussion. So humans are at the center of many of the important digital technologies, but not so when you use algorithms to replace workers, which is the automation part of it, which is the one that I'm talking about as not bringing enough productivity growth.
So I actually think that the COVID crisis, first of all, it is a terrible crisis, both from an economic and a health perspective, but hopefully it's temporary. Hopefully the vaccine will work and we'll get it and we'll go back to some level of normalcy. But to your point, Bernie, I think that new normal will be different. There will be a lot more people working from home, either part or full time. There'll be changes in terms of different sectors and how they operate. But to me, the big sort of message or problem from this is that we've, and rightly so, we've boosted the national debt significantly because we had to do stimulus, and we should do another big, massive round of stimulus. But the reality is now the national debt is huge. And there's this recent study that we did for the Concord Coalition that showed if we could raise productivity back to the rates that we had it in the 1960s, by the way, when unemployment was super low and when wage growth was super high, if we could raise productivity, just get back to that level for the next 20 years, we would dramatically reduce the debt to GDP ratio. So what I worry about now is there's this sort of almost this feeling of we can't afford any automation anymore because it hurts people, or we can't afford not having the jobs, which I think is wrong. It doesn't affect jobs. But if we don't do that, the national debt is going to be out of control. Wages are going to be slow. So, and I think also, Duron made this point about AI in the paper that he wrote for MIT. He proposes a tax on AI itself when it's being used for automation. And to me, that would be very harmful. It would really slow down the development and deployment of AI technologies that we're going to need.
All right, so you have sparked lots of questions here from the audience, so I will sort of take these from the top. The first one is the American workforce even ready for the work of AI-enabled industrial development?
Should I jump in?
Sure.
Yeah, I don't think it is. I think, there are many different demands that work of the future will make from workers. There is growing evidence that social skills are becoming more important. And part of the reason why social skills are becoming more important is precisely because some of the more routine tasks that workers would perform, even some of those that are quantitative, are being replaced by algorithms. So there is need for workers that have some computer literacy, but also plenty of social skills, flexibility, and we're not there yet. And that might be one of the reasons why there has not been enough of the human complementary technologies. But I think we definitely need a very holistic approach to how we can further the opportunities for workers. And on one thing, I completely agree with Rob. I want to, since we've almost disagreed on everything, including our readings of very simple economics articles and principles of economics textbooks. But one thing I completely agree with him, productivity growth is critical. So the more productivity growth you have, the more jobs you're going to create, the more wage growth you're going to generate. So there's no disagreement on that one. The question is, are we adopting the right incentive scheme for businesses through our tax policies, through our R&D policies, through our market structure that encourages productivity growth? And the answer seems to be no. If you look at the numbers, we are going through one of the slowest productivity growth periods in US history, and the same is true for almost all OECD countries. So there is something wrong. Perhaps it's not taxes, perhaps it's something else, but clearly the technologies that businesses are adopting are not working.
So, by the way, if we are taxing automation too little and we're getting too much of it, it definitely would show up in labor productivity. I could see your argument, although I don't agree with it, that it wouldn't show up in TFP, but it would definitely show up in labor productivity, and we're not seeing that. Bernie, one thing, another response, by the way, is I actually think a lot of companies are doing complementary robotics and automation with workers. I mean, you look at a company like BMW, where they massive investment in automation for one of their lines, but they didn't replace any workers. It was really automation technology to complement the worker, to give them more flexibility so they can shift from one model or one type of car to another much more quickly. But I think the key point of that question, to me, is the failure of U.S. policy. And I really use that term failure because it is a failure compared to many of our other competitors. We don't have anywhere near the kinds of policies we need to prepare workers for future work, whether it's in manufacturing and other things. Places like Singapore, France, Sweden, they really have thought this through much more sophisticated, much more carefully than we have. So it's really, to me, incumbent upon Congress in this next Congress to put in place some policies so workers are able to adapt to these technologies and companies can use them more effectively.
All right, so Duron, you're kind of the road team here. So we have some skeptical questions for you about your arguments. I'll go into one of those right now, and that is, can you explain the displacement effect in relation to the productivity increase? Is this a question of better distributing the benefits of automation?
No, it's not just better distributing the benefits of automation. So think about it this way. Whenever you replace workers with a machine, you are doing two things. You're first changing how you produce your existing output. So if I'm a car company and I introduce a robot that does the tasks that were previously done by welders, and I do not change the number of cars I produce, and the rest of the economy doesn't change anything, then there is just a displacement effect. That's the displacement effect. And that's clearly we're going to need fewer welders. But of course, even if I could make this mistake, my co-authors are great economists, they wouldn't be. We are all steeped in general equilibrium and understanding of the economy. We do not assume that everything else remains the same. The reduction in the costs that substituting robots brings will change the amount of cars you produce and perhaps the amount of other things that you produce in the economy. Now that's where the productivity effect is. So that productivity effect, that we have reduced costs and we become more productive, we wanted to produce more cars and perhaps more lattes for people to sip in their fancy cars, is that going to suck enough of the labor that was displaced? There is no theoretical answer to this question. It may or may not. So Rob somehow thinks that there's a theoretical law that it should. That's not true. So the question boils down to how much productivity gain do you generate? And the evidence generally is that the recent automation technologies haven't generated enough of the productivity effect, and that's part of the reason why productivity growth is so low, that the displacement effect has not been compensated for, let alone more than compensated for. And if you look at historical episodes, typically the reason why we have generated a lot of jobs isn't this automatic productivity effect. Go back to the mechanization of agriculture. So the same argument would be, oh, we should just mechanize agriculture and that will work out things by itself and the US economy is going to grow. Of course, mechanization of agriculture helped the US economy in terms of reducing the cost of agricultural products. But if you look at the data, most of the employment growth during that period didn't come from agriculture. It came from other sectors that completely changed their technologies. This is the period where many new industries flourished. Manufacturing jobs became very much more complex. Clerical jobs, non-production jobs, design jobs started coming up thanks to the higher human capital. So that actually relates to the first question. And completely new sectors in the non-production, non-manufacturing side, such as clerical, retail, sales, completely new things started coming up. So it was those activities that pulled employment. That's what I'm calling for. I think our singular focus on automation, which is driven by partly business interests, partly by the model of big tech that has brought sort of algorithmic replacement to the fore. But for a variety of reasons, we're just focusing on automation and not doing the sorts of things that saved us and made us much richer during the mechanization of agriculture era.
So if I can just respond to 2 points on that. The theory, there's a theory that there is compensation in terms of job. Yeah, I believe in that. I know Say's law is criticized by economists, but I think Say's law has held up quite well. Supply creates its own demand. But I don't even need to rely on theory. I will rely on a much more pragmatic thing, and that's called the Fed. When unemployment gets too high, the Fed lowers interest rates, and we get back to normal, assuming we're not in a crisis. That's the adjustment process. On this point about, Darren's point about when we had agricultural productivity and somehow we created new industries, and we're not creating enough new industries to sort of suck up all this excess labor demand, that actually is not true historically. We looked at a study where we were able to get BLS occupational data for every occupation by every decade from 1870 to the present. And what you find when you look at that study, the majority of jobs that were created after there was automation didn't come from new sectors. They just came from people going out and eating more, or people buying more restaurant food. I mean, it's existing industries that where consumer demand grows and they just employ more people. We could never create another new industry in the future. Hopefully we won't. We will do that, but we could never do that, and we'd still have enough jobs because people just go out and they spend money. So this notion somehow that there could be automation and just, this time it's not going to compensate fully. Again, no evidence of that historically, no logic for that. It's just not what's going to happen.
So actually, I'm going to jump back to an answer Rob gave a question ago with this question from the audience, which was about the sort of the failure of our government to sort of prepare workers for the future. And that is, what is the policy response governments can consider to counter the negative impacts of excessive automation on workers?
Well, I don't think there's a difference between negative impact of automation on workers and negative impact on automation on the economy. So, for example, when the longshoremen in LA, pushed back against automating the port, sure, they might have kept their jobs, but it hurt the rest of us as Americans. It hurt the rest of us as consumers. We're now paying more for freight shipping. So that doesn't mean those aren't important questions. Those are critical questions, but there's lots of things we could do. For example, our unemployment system, because it's run by the states and they all have incentives to keep unemployment benefits super low. The federal government could fix that. We laid out a proposal for how to do that. We could provide, and maybe going to Darren's point, we could provide the R&D tax credit, but allow it to be applied for training frontline workers. In other words, give companies incentives to train their workers so that when they are laid off, they have better core skills. So many things. The French and the Singaporeans have training vouchers. So when a worker gets laid off, they can, another simple thing. In the US, when you get laid off and you're collecting unemployment insurance, it's very, very hard for you to get to go to a community college and get training. We make it hard. We could instead go exactly the opposite. We could encourage people to go back and get more education and training when they're laid off, and then that's when they have income support. So there's many, many things we can do. And in some ways, I can see why people are afraid of automation, because it's, we've made it this thing of, well, you're on your own. Tough luck, buddy or gal. Just see how well you can do. And other countries don't do that. They provide much more support, particularly in the Scandinavian countries.
Well, let me just say one thing, going back to another point that Rob made earlier. He mentioned the BMW example. I think Germany actually is one country where productivity growth has not slowed down as much. And part of the reason for that is because they have, at the same time, created other jobs in the process of automation. So if you look at what happens when German firms introduce robots, they also cut non-production jobs. They also cut wages. So the evidence is quite clear. But they are at the same time creating non-production jobs. And that's partly because the workers are more skilled. So not all of them can be need to be stuck in the same occupation. So firms find new things for them to do. And part of the reason is because of a better social safety net, demand is not falling as much. So some of the neighboring industries are not being as indirectly affected. But generally, automation is embedded in an ecosystem of other technological changes, just like what I was asking about. So that's an important aspect. And if you look at the treatment of labor in Germany, it's much better than the US. So the German system, both the tax code and other things, is not so capital biased. And I think that has an element as well. So some recent work by my colleague Simon Jaeger, for example, shows that automation, especially adoption of robots, works much better when workers are in the boardroom. They have representation because they can actually work with the company in order to find better use for the displaced workers.
All right, so I've got sort of a skeptical question for Rob here, and I think perhaps one of the things we haven't talked about enough in this discussion is the growth of inequality in our economy and the role that tech and automation have played in that. And so the question we have here is, basically, Rob said all automation is good, but when you look at telephone operators, research shows this came at the expense of middle-class women, and are we not paying enough attention to the inequality aspect here?
Well, we should be paying attention to inequality, absolutely, but we're looking in all the wrong places if we're looking at automation. The evidence is quite clear that automation has not increased, has not been the cause of this, of income inequality. And for example, in our book that I wrote with Mike Lynn, Big is Beautiful, Debunking the Myth of Small Business, a very interesting study from a few years ago, and it found that something like, I don't know, I'm going to get the number wrong. 7 of the richest hedge fund managers in America made more in a year than the top 500 corporate CEOs. So if you want to look at at income inequality, it's not, as people would say, the 50-10 ratio, the middle to the bottom, or even the 90-10 ratio. It's the 99.1%, 99.9%. It's the super rich. That's the problem. And that is not a problem that's related to automation. Some hedge fund manager making $3 billion a year isn't because there's automation. Another point I'll make is I wrote a report for the G7, asked me to write a report on the future of work and jobs. And one of the interesting things, and actually the Obama, one of the last reports that the CEA came out with before they left, made the same argument and the same data that we did. If you look at the risk of automation now with AI and other technologies and robots in terms of wage levels, it's actually now very different than what it was in the last 30 years, which it was more middle-class jobs, operators, travel agents, blue-collar workers. And so that, that is a problem. Although, as Steve Rose has shown, about 2/3 of those workers moved up into the upper middle, not the rich, the upper middle. 1/3 went down. But anyway, the point is, most of this new technology appears to be much more likely to impact low-wage workers, people making $8 an hour, $12 an hour. To me, that is the core solution, a core solution to income inequality. We have too many bad jobs in the US. You can't pay these people a lot more money. We should increase the minimum wage, I would argue, but you can't pay them a whole lot more because they're in low value added jobs with low productivity. If we can automate a lot of those jobs, a lot of those workers will automatically move to middle wage jobs, especially if we provide the training and other employment assistance.
Well, look, we have two more things to agree with. So I would be in favor of increasing the minimum wage too, and I also think that people should distinguish top 1% hedge fund inequality from what's going on to workers, in the broad scheme of things. But I think beyond that, there isn't as much agreement. So the question was completely on target, was referring to a recent paper by Feigenbaum and Gross, which is on telephone operators, which shows exactly what the questionnaire said. There was a lot of displacement of these operators. And in fact, my work with Pascual Restrepo shows that when you have automation or robots, that has major inequality implications. Robots reduce the wages of exactly the middle class occupations and the workers below that, because that creates more competition for that. So in local labor markets where you have more robot adoption, inequality increases. It increases all the way up to the 60th or the 70th percentile. And actually automation technologies on the whole at the macro level appear to have played a fairly major role in the increase in the inequality in the US, but absolutely there are other factors as well.
All right, so it seems like we have about 3.5 minutes left here. So I'm going to offer one last question. And if you guys maybe perhaps want to put in any sort of final remarks you might have within that answer. And it's about, the question is, how about offshoring's impact on wages? The time period of declining wages matches the period of increasing trade deficits. So I guess, one of the questions here is, have we thought enough about sort of globalization largely and its impact on automation and taxes and its role in this perhaps more specific question?
Well, I can jump in. First of all, I think one mistake that many economists have made, and I would compliment Duron's colleague David Otter, because he did not make that mistake, and his work was instrumental. The mythology out there is that most of the manufacturing jobs that have been lost in the US, these middle-class, good blue-collar jobs where maybe you don't need a college degree, have been lost because of automation. The reality is at least half of them, if not more, have been lost due to offshoring. And the problem is, why is that confusing, or why don't people understand that? His problem is really largely around mismeasurement of certain sectors, like the computer sector output from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. We've written extensively about that. So is Susan Hausman and others. The bottom line is we've lost a lot of manufacturing jobs because of China and principally competition. And that I would argue has reduced demand for manufacturing labor and has meant wage restraint. So to me, what is the answer to that? The answer to that is, A, get a lot tougher on Chinese mercantilism and other countries, but also really much more importantly, finally put in place a national industrial policy or a national industrial strategy, which we don't have. We could significantly expand manufacturing output and jobs in this country, probably by 1/3, if we had a real strategy, which we have not put in place, but hopefully maybe we will. There seems to be growing bipartisan interest in that.
Well, if I could just jump in, just one other thing that Rob and I agree on. So completely, I second what he said about offshoring, but there's a slight inconsistency in what Rob has argued over the last hour, because the way that offshoring works is actually very, very similar to automation. What is offshoring? That you take some tasks that workers used to do and you send them to China. What is automation? You take some tasks that workers used to perform and you give it to robots or algorithms. Both of them create a productivity effect. Both of them create a displacement effect. So you cannot say that categorically automation is always good and offshoring is always bad. They work exactly the same way. And actually, we're making the same mistake with automation as offshoring. We are creating tax incentives for companies to offshore because they actually avoid profit taxes and lots of other taxes when they offshore through transfer pricing and other things. And they also can access lower wages because Chinese labor market is not regulated. It doesn't doesn't have the same safety requirements that US has and should have. So actually, there's a big parallel between offshoring and automation. And I would have exactly the same attitude. We have to look at it in a case-by-case basis. Offshoring is okay if it's part of a broader technological and business strategy where we are creating a lot of new technologies, new tasks, and new opportunities for labor. That's the one final thing I want to emphasize again. I am certainly not arguing against business or automation or robots. It is just that we need a much more balanced technology strategy so that we create jobs as well as at the same time as we automate and some of these tasks are disappearing from workers. Thank you very much.
I'll just quickly add, by the way, offshoring clearly not raised productivity. It's lowered productivity, so it's quite different. I don't think they're quite the same. But I think, again, just close by saying we need more automation of all kinds, complementary, non-complementary, and we should have a tax code that actively spurs it, which would be my argument. So thank you.
All right, we're gonna have to leave it there. Based on your questions, you guys could listen to another hour of Robin Duron. But we will have to leave it there. And thank you both for your time. And this was really enjoyable. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Bernie.
Thank you.
Thank you.